I want to thank our demo presenters who showed off some truly amazing projects, and the eye gaze technology is amazing as well. Now, if computing can help people with disabilities get around more easily, surely computer science can solve the problems of privacy and security that plague our connected lifestyles. At least that's what I was hoping to learn, as we once more put research in focus. Now, we're all aware of security and privacy concerns that surround our use of emails and social media, whether it's phishing scams, Trojan horses, you name it. But now with the proliferation of mobile devices that track our movements and initiate interactions, those concerns are even more acute. And if you're like me, you're worried about keeping your personal information safe. I'm lucky I'm joined by two experts on privacy and security in this brave new world. Peter Druschel, who's the Scientific Director of the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems, and Stefan Saroiu, a Senior Researcher at Microsoft Research. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Peter, I'm going to start with you. What concerns you most these days in terms of privacy?
Well, one concern has to do with these many popular applications and services that keep track of people's locations, their physical activities, their health status, and increasingly also their social encounters. Now, on the one hand, these applications are fantastic because they help people organize their lives, stay fit and healthy, and also get in touch with some of the people in their vicinity. But on the other hand, these applications and services really take the privacy risks to an entirely new level because they really blur the distinction between online and offline worlds. They're not only recording, your online activity, which is deliberate and voluntary, but they sort of seamlessly track your physical whereabouts, and that is, something that raises the question of what happens to the data that's being recorded, and I think that's something we'll really have to pay attention to.
So they can get hold of the information and exploit it. I mean, how exactly do they do that?
Well, the problem starts with the fact that these applications really store and collect and store this data and initially store it on your mobile device. So for instance, if you contract some malware, which is easy enough to do, you go to the wrong website, you open an email attachment, or you fall for one of the phishing attacks, that malware can compromise your phone and potentially get access and expose that kind of data. Another important risk is that many of these apps actually upload that data to the app provider's cloud website. And at that point, the user really has no control or not even knowledge of what happens to the data from that point on.
And how do we counter these threats? Are there tools or behaviors that we should adopt to prevent this unwanted spying?
Right. Well, in terms of tools, there really isn't that much available today in production. Right? You all know when you install an app, you're supposed to grant permission for that app to install, to access certain information like your contacts, or you get access to certain sensors like your location provider. But quite often, right, these requests seem plausible to us, and we're interested in the functionality that this application provides, so we grant it. And this is really an all or nothing decision because once the application has access to the information, we don't really know and can't control what happens, how it's being used, how it's being disseminated. Now there is quite a bit of research in the area, right? There are people working on techniques to try to track the flow of information through such applications. There are people working on encryption. I think Stefan is going to talk about that a little bit. We've also been working on something towards developing a communication platform that enables such apps to, contact and communicate with nearby devices, but in a way that keeps the user in control of their privacy.
I gather there's another aspect, and that's the privacy of bystanders. Can you describe the issue here?
Yeah, so this is a related aspect, and it's got to do with the fact that our smartphones and increasingly wearable devices have these sophisticated audio-visual capture capabilities, which has led actually to entirely new creative outlets. People are taking videos and pictures all the time, upload them on Facebook, on YouTube. That's a fantastic thing. But the thing that really hasn't been addressed is that quite often in social situations, unrelated bystanders just incidentally get captured in such a recording, and in many situations they're not actually okay with that. Right?
I mean, this is kind of a different issue, isn't it? Short of going around getting signed permission of all these people and all these people who might be on your social media, how can you avoid invading their privacy?
Well, it's indeed a challenge because on the one hand you want to respect people's privacy, on the other hand you want to preserve the spontaneity and ubiquity of this kind of digital capture. So we've been working actually on a prototype where the idea is to enable people to state their preferences with respect to capture privacy, dependent on their current context. So they can say, for instance, when I'm among friends, no restrictions on image capture. When I'm at the workplace, also no restriction. But when I'm in public, I want to have my face blurred. And when I'm at the beach or a similar location like the gym or a healthcare facility, I don't want to have my image captured at all. This would be recorded by my own smart device, my smartphone, for instance, and then advertised to nearby capture devices over a short-range radio. And capture devices in their platform would then be enabled to essentially receive these preferences and check a captured image to see if some bystander was captured, and then edit the media, the video or the image to respect that person's privacy.
And how do the public view these inadvertent privacy invasions?
Well, that's an interesting question. There is some work on that from social scientists, and we've also done a small-scale online survey on this. And essentially the outcomes are that, on the one hand, people's preferences with respect to this kind of capture are very situational, right? It depends on the context. Who's around me? Am I among friends, among strangers? Who's the photographer, right? Is it a friend? Is it someone in some kind of an official function, like a wedding photographer, or is it a complete stranger? And secondly, what we found is, and others have found as well, is that there are considerable individual differences among preferences that people have in the same situation. It seems to be a cultural and personal thing.
Thanks very much for that. Stefan, I want to ask you the same opening question I asked Peter. What concerns you most these days about privacy and security?
So, everything that Peter said actually concerns me as well, but additionally, the thing that concerns me is that the ease by which these mobile devices that we're carrying, how easily they're lost or stolen. Arguably, I think it's pretty clear that mobile, smartphones and tablets are much more easily lost or stolen than desktops were, or even laptops.
And can encryption solve this problem?
Right. So for a long time, people were worried about lost devices, especially with laptops. And both the industry and research community basically came up with these systems that offer encryption of your data. And what they do is the guarantee they offer is called protecting data at rest. So whenever the data is stored on your hard drive, on your storage system, the data is encrypted. And the keys that we use to actually encrypt this data are protected by some password or PIN that the user is asked to enter when these devices actually start up. And because most of the time laptops are either shut down or hibernating, this is an adequate sort of security model. On the other hand, tablets and smartphones are rarely shut down. They are often in this sleep state, and all it takes is pressing the power button. Actually, they resume operation and have all this data lying unencryptedly in their RAMs. And both enterprises and device owners are very concerned with a number of attacks that can be mounted to steal, data, unencrypted data lying in these devices' memories.
Oh, and what kind of attacks? I mean, are there any current or potential technological solutions?
Yeah,
to those?
Definitely. These attacks have been known for a long time. They basically are referred to in the literature as memory attacks. And one class of attacks are cold boot attacks, where actually it turns out that when a piece of memory loses power, it still preserves its contents for a short period of time. This is referred to the data remnants property that memory has. So the attack typically is that I can basically steal your phone and maybe reflash it with my own software. And while it's reflashing and going through that reboot cycle, the memory still preserves some of its contents, and I can read them that way. But there are also what they're called bus monitoring attacks, where I actually look at the data that flows between your processor and the memory. And there are actually trivial devices that actually read this memory traversing these buses. In fact, there's a company that sells a bus monitoring device that you can plug in your iPad and transform your iPad into this device that can read secrets from memory.
Wow. And encryption technologies. Will they, are they available? Are they available yet?
Yes. So basically the next barrier for us, or the next sort of goal for us, is to make sure that data stays, or sensitive data at the very least, remains encrypted even when it's in memory. So the model, the system that we're actually going towards is one where every time sensitive data leaves the boundary or the perimeter of the processor is going to be encrypted. So the only place when the data is actually unencrypted is in the processor. And mounting attacks on the processor is much more difficult, much more costlier. And we've built a system like that where you can take your email or your contact information and make sure that whenever you process on it, it has this property that all data is encrypted when it lies in memory.
What do you suggest people do in the meantime? And how long have we got to wait for these encryption programs?
So encrypted memory, actually, if you look at the industry trends, it's coming down the road. The hardware manufacturers are sort of putting resources into coming up with hardware solutions to make sure that our memory is encrypted at all times. Nevertheless, a hardware-only solution is actually expensive and it's difficult to adopt because building hardware is expensive and deploying it in practice takes several iterations of the market to sort of renew their devices. So that's why in the meantime we've been working on software-only solutions that leverage today's hardware to actually provide these guarantees. Nevertheless, the hardware solution will be much more performant, much better. So I expect probably in about a decade that most of the devices you're going to find in stores are going to have at least some form of encrypted memory in them.
Peter, I'd like you to answer the same sort of question about how do people protect themselves now in terms of social media apps and from having information stolen?
Well, I think the only general advice one could give is to be judicious in selecting apps that we install and services that we sign up for, right? So in general, one shouldn't just evaluate these kinds of apps and services by the functionality they provide, right? That's usually very appealing, but ask, what data does it collect? Is there a legitimate need for that data to be collected? And what happens to that data later on? Now, in general, it's difficult to answer these questions, particularly for a layperson, but one could, for instance, look, does the provider have a privacy statement? Does that answer such questions that I just asked, right? Is the provider a reputable company that operates in a jurisdiction that can be expected to enforce these kinds of rules and have laws that respect privacy?
Stefan, Peter, thank you for your information, if somewhat a little bit disquieting about privacy and security in a world of mobile devices. Now, let's go back to the demo floor where Scarlett has drummed up some pretty good information for us.